A few years ago, you may recall that the famous church in France, in Paris, Notre Dame, burned down. Remember that? You'll see that there on the left. The spire, the steeple of the church came crashing down, and it was a major event worldwide because this is such an important building in the city of Paris, isn't it? Well, they've been rebuilding it, and you'll see on the right side that they've constructed this form, and they're building the new steeple underneath it to bring this back and once again establish it again as this major part of the architecture of the city. Buildings are important. Why do we build buildings, big buildings, as people? I think part of it is to show the technological advancements that we have made. Look what we can do, the Burj Khalifa, for instance, right? Why build something so tall? What's the purpose? It's a statement. Why did the Romans build the way that they built? They built statements. That's what Baalbek is. It's a statement. It's not just, we want to build a temple. It's a declaration. It's a declaration of their own power. It's a declaration of their own authority. Buildings are important. They're cultural symbols. They're religious symbols. Like this. For many people, you think of Paris, you think of the Eiffel Tower, you think of Notre Dame. These two very important, what we call iconic buildings of the city. For many people, though, the building is the most important thing. We have to rebuild the building because the building says something about us. It's interesting here that the building happens to be a church, correct? But the rebuilding of the building is a cultural statement by the people of France. Just this past week, the reason why I'm talking about this, you'll see here in a moment, just this past week, the French president visited Notre Dame. It was in the news, maybe you saw that. And he went there to see the progress of this, and he was up high in one of the upper parts of the church, looking out over the city. And this was clearly something that, again, is a social, cultural statement. He didn't go there to pray. We don't have pictures of him. He's there with a hard hat, right, because they're doing construction, so I'm not going to say anything negative about that. I'd wear a hard hat too if I went there. But I doubt that even on a regular Sunday, many presidents of the world are going to places to pray. I mean, leaders build buildings, but oftentimes leaders build buildings for their own glory, for their own statement of their own position. We left last week. We've been going through the 7th chapter of the book of Acts, looking at Stephen's sermon, in which he recounts to the religious leaders the history of the nation. And last week we left the nation with Moses. Moses had received the law. Moses built a tabernacle, that this tabernacle, this tent, was a place where the presence of God lived. It was a temporary fixture. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't established. It wasn't set in stone. It was something you could tear down and then move on. It's kind of like what we do every Sunday morning. We come in, we put stuff up, and then we tear it down. We could do this wherever we wanted to do. In fact, we can do this at our house on the first Sunday of the month, if we wanted to. We could do this in that room over there, if we wanted to. We could do this wherever we wanted to, because it's temporary, it's not fixed, it's not established. So we saw Moses last week, or Stephen left the religious leaders and us last week with this statement about who Moses was and what he did, and then he moves from that to taking this temporary tabernacle, this temporary place which God's presence was with the nation, and spoke about how it became an established in a fixed place. He said this in verse 44 of Acts chapter 7. He said, "Our fathers had the tent of witness in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it." Who is the one who spoke to Moses? God, obviously. "According to the pattern that he had seen, our fathers in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers. So it was until the days of David." Now we have a new character. So he talks about Moses and Joshua went into the land, and this happened. They had this temporary tent until the time of David, he says, who found favor in the sight of God and asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, as the prophet says, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? What is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all these things?" This is Stephan quoting Isaiah. You get to hear Isaiah chapter 66, verses 1 and 2. So the story is that Moses did not enter the promised land as we just saw. He and the rest of his generation were not allowed to because they all disobeyed God in one way or the other. So God said, "You're not going into the promised land." And he instead had Joshua, Moses' associate, lead the nation into this land. And so Joshua led them in, and when they got there, they established themselves in the land that God had promised, and they had this temporary tabernacle, this temporary tent. But eventually, the nation began to look around and see the other nations around them and say, they all have kings. We don't have a king. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever looked around and said, those people have that stuff, I don't have that? Maybe it would be good if I had that. Be careful. They have kings, we don't have a king. All we have is this law that God gave to Moses in Sinai, and we have these priests that tell us what we're supposed to do. We don't have any ruler to rule over us. We have no king. So the people began to complain that they didn't have a king. They wanted a king. And God told the prophet at the time, I want you to tell them this. They want a king? This is what's going to happen if they get a king. Samuel said, if you have a king, he's going to take your sons and he's going to make them serve with his chariots and horses. And they will run in front of his chariots. In other words, you want a king? Get ready for war. You want a king? Because the king is going to come, he's going to take your sons, and he's going to put them out in front of the chariot. That's exactly what a king does, right? Just think about it. The king's not the one who's out in the front. He takes your kids, your sons, and he puts them out there in front of the chariot. They're the ones who are going to take the brunt of the war. They're going to face the problems. He's going to be back here. That's what a king does, right? We protect the king. You want a king? This is what you're going to have. Some he's going to assign to lead thousands, some 50s. He's going to have them plow his ground and reap his harvest. Still others are going to make weapons of war and equipment for his desires. He will take your daughters, and they will be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the rest of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle, the donkeys. He will take all of these for his own use. I'm reading in 1 Samuel chapter 8, if you're interested. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer.
This is what leaders do. This is what kings do. This is what emperors do. Prime ministers and presidents of all nations all around the world. The United States a few years ago said, you know what? We should go someplace. We're going to go to Iraq and we're going to avenge some thing that happened to us. And we're going to go to Iraq, and there we're going to bring them freedom and democracy from a tyrant who's oppressing them. Right? So what do? He takes all the sons and the daughters and said, we're all in this together. Drums them all up and takes taxes and says, we're going to do all this, and then sends them off. And eventually we realize, really, this was all just so that you could take some more into your pocket? This is what leaders do. This is what kings do. You want a king? This is what's going to happen. We need to be careful. We have a lot of discussion going on in our world now, which is combining religion and politics. It's been going on in Lebanon for a long time, and it's been going on around the world, actually for a long time, but it's particularly prevalent here in Lebanon. We see it. We need to be careful in combining these two things, because when we align ourselves to a particular leader, a particular group, and we say, this is the person I'm going to follow, I think God stands back and says, you really want that? You're going to choose that over me? Honestly? You think that that person has your best interest at heart? Not me? And we say, yeah, but if I go along, they can give me some of their gold too. Yeah, they will, until you're dead. Until they've used you up and spit you out and cast you aside. The first king was a man like this. His name was Saul. He was not a very good king. He was not the king that they wanted. But rarely when we ask for something that's not in God's will, do we get the thing that we imagined it would be. It's almost never that. Whenever you do something outside of what God tells you to do, whatever ideal image you think this is going to be, whatever dream this is, it's not that. It's never that. Because God's plan is always better. So be careful. God had a different plan. God wanted a man named David to be the king. God sent Samuel, and Samuel went and anointed David king, and then when Saul died by killing himself in battle, because he didn't want to be taken, Saul himself fell on his own sword, David became king. David reigned from 1000 BC to approximately 960 BC. And David established the kingdom. The David that we just talked about, that Stephen just told the nation about. David established the kingdom, and he's revered to this day as the great king of the nation of Israel. Jerusalem is called the city of David. He built it. David built the city initially. 960 BC. David strengthened the kingdom. He put down all the other nations around him, and he established the kingdom as a power. God promised David that his descendants would be on the throne as the king as long as they obeyed him, and eventually that the Messiah himself would come from David's descendants. So David is a towering, major figure in the history of the nation. But God did not let David build the temple. Who does it say here, build the temple? Go back. One more. Two more. Right here. Who built the house for God? Anyone? Solomon built it. David didn't build it. Why did David not build it? David didn't build it because God said, I don't want a warrior to build a house for me. Now let me just check this, because I don't think God is saying that anyone who fights in battle, that anyone who's in the army, anyone who's a warrior is automatically bad. And that this should be something against them. This is not what he's saying. So let's be careful. Okay, we don't want to go to extremes. What he's saying is this: when you are the leader, David, when you are the one who makes the decisions to send people out and to do these things, the people who follow you, they're not the one who is to blame. You say you do this, and they say, okay, I'm under your authority and I do this. Ultimately, it comes back to that person. Now, if we have a choice to say I want to be under that person's authority or not, then we have to bear the responsibility of that decision. But there are some places in the world in which you actually don't have a choice to be in the military. You have to. If you're part of that nation, they obligate you to be a part of that. You don't have a choice. You go there and then you're obligated to do what you're told to do. And I know several friends of mine who have struggled in the military in the United States because they've been told to do things and they are believers and they say, I don't know, but I'm supposed to obey. But there's something going on here that's a struggle within me, and it plagues them for years and years and years after the fact. That's the reality of the world that we live in. God said, I don't want that concept and that person who's doing that and making those decisions to be the one who builds my temple. I'm going to have your son build my temple. But David was invested in it. David wanted to build the temple of God. David loved God. David wasn't rebellious. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't rebellious. He wanted to build the temple, but God said, not you, your son. But David had planned, actually, the whole temple. So in 1 Chronicles 28, 11 and 19, stop here for a minute, go back. So this is the tabernacle. This is just an image. Go to the picture. This is just an image of what it could have looked like. Nobody knows, of course, but basically, this is what something might have looked like. Continue on. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 11 through 19, David wrote out and explained every aspect of this temple that he then gave to Solomon. So even though David was not going to be the one to build it, he laid out all the plans for it. It says in verse 19, all this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. So while David was not the one who built it, he was the one who laid it out. Then Solomon built the temple. We don't know what it looked like, but it was built sometime between 970 and 930. Eventually it was destroyed by the Babylonian Emperor Nebuchadnezzar II. In this temple, there was an area called the Holy of Holies. It's the place where the Ark of the Covenant was. Who knows what the Ark of the Covenant? What's special about it, Caleb? Sorry? God's presence was there. What was inside the Ark? The tablets that were given to Moses. These that were put there, they had certain things that were in this Ark that was in the Holy of Holies. So the actual law was in this Ark of the Covenant that was put in the Holy of Holies. It was the place where God's presence resided. What have we been singing about? What have we been talking about over the past month? The presence of God. The presence of God was in this Holy of Holies, the holiest place that only the high priest could go into. Sacrifices were made regularly at the temple. It was a site of the worship of God for this nation. We have the dimensions of the temple. This is simply a depiction of it. We don't know what it actually looked like, but maybe this was drawn to those dimensions. I'm not sure. The temple was destroyed when the Babylonians came and conquered the region. One of the reasons why this happened, the scriptures tell us, is because the nation itself, once they had a king, what happened? They started fighting about who should be the leader. And eventually the nation divided. And you had two kingdoms. You had one kingdom that was called the Kingdom of Israel. You had one kingdom that was called the Kingdom of Judah. And these two nations fought against one another. Previously, they had been all one nation. Now they were divided and fighting against each other. And it divided them. And eventually, other nations came in and took over the Babylonians. The Babylonians came in and they destroyed this temple that Solomon built sometime around 587, 586 BC. It was later rebuilt. It was called the Second Temple. It was, the exact building of it is disputed. We don't know exactly when. Some say it started in 516. Some say it went through progressions. Some say most of it was built in the 390s. Others note that all the way up to 18 BC, not too long before Jesus, that Herod was still building aspects of the temple. Regardless of this, when we talk about the temple that Stephan is talking about to the religious leaders that we read earlier, this is the temple he's talking about. The Second Temple. There's some major differences between the First Temple and the Second Temple. In the Jewish tradition, in their commentary and descriptions of their own religious practice, they said this about the Second Temple. The Babylonian Talmud notes that the Ark of the Covenant, the ark that covers upon it, the cherubs that were on the cover, the fire and the divine presence and the divine spirit, and the Urim and Thummim, which were two rock stones on the priest's breastplate. The Talmud tells us these were not in the Second Temple. The Ark of the Covenant was gone. When the first temple was taken, it was seized and taken and lost forever. All right, Raiders of the Lost Ark, remember that movie years ago? They're still searching for it. It's gone forever. We don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is anymore. So they didn't bring that back and put it into the Second Temple. So when Stephen is standing there telling the religious leaders in Acts chapter 7, the temple that Solomon built had the presence of God in it, they themselves might be thinking, yeah, but our temple is not the same temple. We don't have the Ark of the Covenant. We don't have the Mosaic Law anymore. We don't have the same presence of God that was there at the time. The Babylonians took that and destroyed that, and it's all gone. In fact, when you think about this, what was the accusation that the religious leaders at Jesus' trial made against him that caused them to crucify him? What did they say about him? What was the false testimony? Anyone remember? He would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Let's see that. Matthew chapter 26. Now the chief priests of the whole council, who are these chief priests of the whole council? The same guys that Stephen's preaching to. But this is a little bit earlier, with them talking to Jesus himself. They were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at last two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The claim that they made is that he is going to destroy the temple. And what Stephen is doing, he's telling them that you have killed Jesus wrongfully. We're going to see that very clearly next week. Even if Jesus actually meant that he was going to literally destroy the temple, and they got angry about it, the only thing it proves is that they were interested in the building. Shows nothing else. It doesn't show that they were interested in the presence of God. Because Jesus had, for 3 years, walked in front of them and among them and shown them the presence of God is here, in me. And they didn't care about that. The only thing they cared about was the building. So even if Jesus meant that, it's still an indictment, not upon him, but upon them. And then Stephen, quoting Isaiah chapter 66, reminded them that God does not dwell in a place built by hands. Stephen did not tell them, the temple that you guys were interested in, the temple that you killed Jesus over, is not even Solomon's temple. It doesn't even have the Ark of the Covenant. You guys know that. It doesn't even have the presence of God. You and your rabbis have already said that. Stephen doesn't tell them that. He says, the temple that Solomon built, you know is destroyed, they know is destroyed. But Isaiah said, God's not found in a place built by hands. Let's think of this historically. Forgive me, I'm a historian, as you see. Let's think about this historically. So the temple is destroyed in 587, 586 BC. Isaiah prophesies after that. So Isaiah is prophesying in a time period in which the temple did not exist. In which people would say, "Oh no, the temple of God is gone. What are we we going to do? Where's the presence of God now that we have no temple? And God came to Isaiah and said, I want you to tell the people that I do not dwell in a place built by hands. He said, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? When heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool, what mammoth building can you build that contains me? You can't. Where is the place of my rest? Where do I go home to at night and chill out and rest? No place. Did not my hand make all these things? So Isaiah prophesies before Jesus arrives and before these religious leaders are sitting on their own thrones, Isaiah had already told the nation, God does not dwell in a place built by hands. And then they rebuilt the temple and started to think, God dwells in a place built by hands. And here comes this guy saying that he's going to destroy this thing in 3 days. He's going to destroy the place that God is in, where we worship God, that God communicates with us. He's going to destroy this? Wait a minute. Did you not understand what Isaiah already said? This is not who God is. You can build a temple. You can build a third temple. And God does not dwell there. God does not dwell in places built by hands. Where is God? He's supreme over everything. The heaven is his throne. The earth is his footstool. What are you going to build? What are you going to offer? What criteria are you going to place upon God and say, I will only worship you if you do this and this and this for me? Otherwise, who are you? And God says, do you understand what you're saying? You're going to build a house for me? You're going to talk to me this way? You're going to think that you can approach me? I have made all these things, God said through Isaiah. And Stephen tells these men, God made all these things. You think this temple is important? It's not. Is the biggest church proof of the presence of God? Is the Vatican proof that God dwells there in Rome? No. Is Notre Dame in Paris proof that God is there because we have this huge mammoth building? No. Is that where God dwells? Because it's a big, important place? Harissa? Does God dwell there? Because it's way up on a mountain and everyone can see it. That must be where God is. Is God next door with Marbourgs? Beautiful church? Is God here in this building? Is God impressed with buildings and pilgrimages to places? Does he say, that's great, this really impresses me that you've built this building? You know, in some religions, if you build a place of worship, you actually get a better place in paradise. If you build a place of worship, all of the prayers and all the good deeds that are done in that place of worship are added to you in paradise. That's what some religions teach. Is this what we find here? Where do we meet God? Where do we fulfill the commands that God has given us? Stephen has taken the religious leaders from God of Abraham, the father of the nation, to God of Joseph, saving them from extinction by sending them down to Egypt and preserving them, to God with Moses giving the law and establishing the tabernacle in which he was with them, to God in a permanent fixed place with the temple of Solomon. But even the temple was not sufficient. And Stephen is showing us that God, yes, was in all these places at some point, but God is much bigger than any of those places ever were and ever can be. And whatever we build as humans cannot contain the majesty of God. This was was a journey that Stephen was taking them through, that they would understand that God inhabits the universe itself. In fact, this God who inhabits the universe inhabited Jesus and dwelt among us. The Jesus that these leaders, submitted over to the Romans to be crucified. Stephen was preaching the presence of God. We need to listen. We preach 2,000 years later the presence of God. In this building, yes, God is in this building, but it's not because this is a nice building. God is in this building because children of God are here. That's why God is here, because you are here. And God indwells you. And God is here because you are here. And God is in that small room over there at this time when we meet over there because the children of God are there. And God is in our house on the first Sunday of every month because the children of God are there. And God is where, whenever we meet together, God is there because He indwells us. That's the presence of God. It's not in all of these other things. And I've heard for many years that I've been here in Lebanon, well, you just meet here, you're just a small group there. That can't be the truth. If you don't have all these things with these robes and this gold and all these other things, then you must not have the same history and truth that we have. The same attitude that we see here, which is the presence of God is reflected in the building. In all of the display of religiosity, that's how we know God. This small group that's meeting over in someone's house on a Wednesday night, the presence of God is there. You better believe it. The presence of God is there because the people of God are there. Today, you can know the presence of God. If you will submit your life to Christ, you can know and have the presence of God in your life. Who offers this to you? The God for whom the universe is His throne and the earth is His footstool, became like you and me and gave Himself for us. That God offers to us His presence. I pray this morning that we will understand who God is. And that we will not see Him as an established and fixed presence in one particular location. But that we will see that just like the tabernacle, God's presence roams around wherever you go. God's presence is there. If you're a follower of Christ, God is there. And you need to think about that this week. Whatever you do, however you live, in your work, in your school, when you're sitting in that chair and you're tempted to do something that would dishonor God, you need to remember, I'm sitting in God's presence. It would be like you're sitting right here. If you came here in this building, you might be tempted to not think certain ways or to not do certain things. You could say, how can I do that in a holy place? Wherever you sit, wherever you go is a holy place because God's presence is in you. And we need to begin to think and understand this is who we are. This is what God has done in us. And let us live that way. Give yourself to Him. Experience His presence. Because God's presence can't be contained in a place built by hands. It's in a heart that receives Him. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We ask that we would understand your presence. Lord, that we would see what Stephen is talking about and that we would embrace it ourselves. To understand who you are and give our lives entirely to you. Help us to remember this week that as children of yours, you are in us and guide us, and your presence is always with us. We thank you for that. We pray, Lord, that all that we say and do would give honor and glory to you, that people would see your presence in our lives. Lord, help us to think differently than the people around us. Help us to understand who you truly are and where your presence really